This is not a message necessarily just to mothers. I think it applies to everybody, but it happens to be a message that is from a story that is about a mother. There's a message about a mother and a lesson, hopefully, that every one of us can benefit from today. The book of 1 Kings, chapter number 17. And I'm going to begin, just going to read a short passage, but I will warn you of this. My old superintendent of the district council, when I became part of this state of Oklahoma ministry, his name was Robert Goggin. He made the observation that if someone had a long sermon to preach, they read a short text. But if they didn't have very much to say in a sermon, they read a long text. I'm just going to read a couple of verses here. So brace yourself. The book of 1 Kings, chapter number 17 says, beginning with verse 8, "Then the word of the Lord came to him," that is to Elijah, "and it was saying, Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." Now, in a few moments, I plan to give you a little summary of this story. It's quite a long story. We're just going to take a couple of highlights from it. I'm not going to read it all to you today, but I'm going to try to summarize this story for you. But I want you to see that this lady that is the center part of this portion of Elijah's life very well could have become one of the most insignificant people in the entire nation of Israel on that day, in that day. A single mother was left, and on her shoulders the responsibility of taking care of the physical needs, food, feeding, and taking care of the man of God. And this was not just a man of God. You know, it's not hard to find a preacher. How many knew you could find a preacher if you looked for one? You can find a preacher. In America, in Bixby, there was 3 men that was shipwrecked and left on a desert island. 2 of them was very worried that they'd never be found. The other one said, "There's nothing to worry about. I will be found." And they say, "How can you be so sure of that?" He said, "I'm a member of First Church in Bixby." In other words, nameless church. We're not going to put a name on it. "And I pay $10,000 a month in tithe. And when I miss Sunday, my pastor will find me." That was a lot funnier when I read it than You can find a preacher and you could find a prophet in Israel in this day, but this was not just a prophet. This was the one that the king of Israel described as the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. This is the most significant man of God, alive in this generation. He is so significant that when he was taken to heaven, a replacement specifically had to be appointed to carry his mantle from the time that he went to heaven on. And the well-being of this man, his being able to eat, now rests upon this single mother. The Lord had spoken through Elijah, told him to go to the king and say to the king of Israel, "It's not going to rain again till I say so." Now, a couple of summers ago, I thought that prophet had revisited his ministry here in Oklahoma. As drought set in, and for the last 2 years, we have not had nearly enough rain. And I've been talking to people this spring, and they're talking about how much it's raining. You know, it's just because we got so used to being dry that when it gets normal, everybody thought it was raining a lot. It's not really rained an abnormal amount whatsoever. And so when you think about a drought in Oklahoma, that means that in these rainy months when we need to get several inches of rain, if it only rains a little bit, an inch or so a month. Why, that's not nearly enough, and it leaves a drought condition, and we all are worried, and the crops are going to dry up, and the hay's drying up, and the ponds are drying up, and the lakes are getting shallow, and because it didn't rain enough. If we had a month go by, any month, that we got no rain, that would be a serious thing. And 2 months would be disastrous, and 3 months would be unthinkable. But the prophet Elijah said to the king, it's not going to rain again until I say so. And when 3 months passed, 4 months passed, 6 months passed, a year passed, and it had not rained a drop in Israel. The crops did not produce. The meadows and the pastures were dry. The animals were beginning to faint because they had nothing to eat. And, this was a severe famine. And the king begins to search for Elijah. And God hides Elijah by stream and feeds him. And when I say God fed Elijah, now if you were Elijah, you would have liked it better when God was feeding you, because he was sending messenger birds into the hiding place where he had hidden Elijah. And he was bringing meat and bread every morning and every night. And the prophet just sat there. His whole life consisted of talking with God, praying, and waiting on the birds to come bring him meat in the morning and meat at night and bring him bread to eat. He was well taken care of. But after about a year, that creek began to get, that he was setting beside, began to get dried. It was drying up. And that's when God spoke to the prophet and said, I want you to go to this widow woman. I have commanded her to take care of you. And she's going to feed you. So you go to this widow woman, got this one son, and so the prophet made his way. And so when he found the widow woman, God had commanded her to take care of the prophet. She already knew her job. She had heard from the Lord. But she had a different plan. See, the problem is a lot of times we get a good plan, but it's not a God plan. How many of you have ever had a good plan that turned out not to be God's plan? And she had been going through a drought for about a year, and she had a barrel that she kept the meal in, that she made the cakes, the bread that she fed herself and her only son with. But she had used, in this drought, she had used that meal out of that barrel until there was just one handful of meal left in the bottom of that barrel. And she had estimated that there was enough to make one last cake. And she had a cruse of oil, a container for oil that had just enough oil left in that cruse to pour into that meal to cook and bake one last cake. And the drought was on. It hadn't rained for a year. It showed no signs of rain. If it did rain, how long before they would produce a crop? She had made this plan. God spoke to her and said, I want you to feed Elijah, the man of God, the chariots of Israel, the horsemen thereof. This is the most preeminent man of God in the nation. I want you to take care, I want you to feed him. But the widow says, well, I would love to do that, but I only have enough meal and enough oil to make one last cake, and I've got my son. I'm going to pick up these sticks, this driftwood. I'm going to make a fire. I'm going to mix together this meal with the oil. I'm going to make one last cake. It's all I got enough left for. My son and I are going to divide this last cake, and then we're going to starve to death. That's all I know to do. That was her plan. But as the prophet came, he saw the widow woman, asked for water to drink. She at once went to get him a water to drink, and as she went, he stopped and said, and while you're at it, make me a cake, something to eat, a morsel of bread to eat. And she said, my Lord, I wished I could do that, but I just have enough meal, enough oil for one cake. Got my son here. I'm gathering sticks. That's what I was doing when you came up. Going to make a fire one last time. I'm going to cook my last meal, and my son and I will eat this last meal, and then we don't have anything else to eat. We're out of food. That's it. And the prophet said, well, do what you said, but make that cake and bring it to me first. And as the Lord lives, the meal will not run out of that barrel, and the oil will not waste out of that cruse until the famine is over. And so the Lord had already prompted her. The Bible said, God told the prophet, I have already commanded her to take care of you. Her heart had already been prompted. She didn't really grasp it by faith, but now that the prophet says to do it, she makes the cake, and she brings to the prophet, and he eats that cake, drinks that water that she brought him, and she goes back to the barrel, and much to her amazement, she thought she had used every bit of that meal, but as she shakes it around in the bottom of that barrel, looks like there might be enough that she can get one more handful. So she scoops up that last bit again, and she makes another cake, and got enough oil to make a cake, and she kneads it out, and she puts it on the fire, and she cooks a cake, and she takes it to her son, and they eat it. And that evening, when it becomes mealtime again, she goes back to the barrel and finds enough meal there for one more cake of bread, and pours in the oil and makes a cake and gives it to the man of God, makes another one. She and her son eat again that evening, and the next morning, and the next evening, the next morning after that, and on every time she goes to that meal barrel. Every time she's sure that she's got the last of the meal and used the last of the oil, but when she puts it together, she makes another cake and another cake, and one after that for another year, and then for another year after that, and for 6 more months after that. It had not rained for 3 years and 6 months when God spoke to the prophet, and rain came again. But every day, morning and night, for 2.5 years, this widow woman fed herself and fed her son and fed the man of God for 2 years and 6 months. God commanded his blessing on that little woman and her son and provided for them. I can almost hear the critics. I've seen them. I had a dear friend that pastored a church in Oklahoma City, and after he'd been there for some while, the church was doing fairly well, and he, after being there for some time and knew he was going to stay there for indefinite future, decided he'd build a house for him and his wife, stay in, and 2 children. And so he built a nice house, and somebody got a can of spray paint like what you'd use to, what some vandal would use to spray graffiti on the wall somewhere, and out on the pavement in front of their house wrote the words, "This house was paid for by widows' pensions," in front of the preacher's house. And that sounded like such a terrible insult, but I want you to think about this. You could have said that about Elijah. He was eating the widow's pension. But if he didn't, that widow would have starved. Did you hear me? This was a partnership. And God is the one that established it. Okay, I want to talk to you for just a little while about this faith that will not run out. First of all, I want you to see about this woman. And I think of all the people that, hardworking people, people that many times find themselves in a situation that is difficult, and not necessarily because of anything that they have done to acquire that position. They haven't intentionally done anything to anyone else to hurt them, haven't intentionally been wasteful with whatever opportunities or assets that come in their hand, but for whatever reason, they find themselves in a situation that there seems to be no relief for. They're out of money, or they're sick, or they've got a loved one, a relative that is in some kind of trouble, and they cannot provide deliverance. And they become an insignificant part of their community. That is, when you think about you're going to go establish a new school, you don't go to the people that are mightily oppressed and down on their luck. You go to someone that seems like everything's going their way. And so those people that are going through hard times seem to drift into a place of insignificance. James warned about churches that would throw their attention at the wealthy and show their attention to the ones that came to church in goodly apparel at the expense of the one that came into the fellowship obviously in need. Well, when this widow came to church, she had no physical means of support, and she had a little boy that she was trying to take care of, and no assets, and no hope. And it would seem as though God himself had neglected to take care of this woman. In the days of Israel that she lived, a woman that was destitute like she was would have the opportunity to go into the fields after they had been reaped. That is, someone that, a farmer that had sown wheat or barley in a field, after they had sent their harvesters out to bring in the grain, people like this woman were allowed by law to go in and glean what had been left by the reapers. And so she would be spared starvation. She could just go into the fields of those that had been blessed and pick up what they had left behind. And that had been her means of support from the time that her child was born and became her responsibility. And she had made it like that until now. Because now the fields are withered and drought has set in, and her only means of survival has been taken from her. And it looks as if the God of mercy that put in his law that women that were destitute, as she was, would have a means of survival, had withheld from her the means of survival. And God himself, it seemed that God himself had forsaken her. But in that moment, God, looking upon the greatest task at hand, the most important thing for Israel that day is not to keep the king alive. It's not for the armies to march and win a victory in a foreign soil. The greatest thing is not some political victory to be won in the land of Israel. The most important thing for Israel in that day is the man of God. He's the one that has the word of the Lord. He's the one that's going to speak the word that will one day end the drought and bring the rain, and the fields that have become dry will be healed again. It all depends on the man of God speaking the word when the time comes. But somebody has got to keep him alive in the drought until the time comes. It's sure quiet in this church. Did I teach you to be quiet like that? I just noticed it's quiet in this church today. But this man of God has got to speak the word, and God looks down and sees this widow woman. And he gives her the most important task that anyone in Israel will have, and that is to keep alive the man of God until he speaks the word. Listen, somebody needs to talk to the person next to you and say, he's really preaching to us. We need to pay attention. God had commanded on this widow woman the most important task. Listen, you might have felt like that everything about your life was about you just surviving one day. But I'm here to tell you that God has put you in the center of his plan. Even this widow woman who seemed so insignificant that she had no reason to get out of bed in the morning except to pick up some driftwood and make one more cake to feed herself and her son, and then the two of them would starve to death. It seemed as if there was no purpose for her to live on except God had given her a calling. And I'm here to say to you, find it. God has given you a calling. There is a reason for you to get out of bed tomorrow morning. There is a reason for you to survive. There is a reason, a purpose for your life. And God has commanded upon you an assignment. And the greatest thing you could do is find what God has called you to do and do it. Yes. And so this widow woman had a calling. And she not only had a calling, but she had provision. I'm sure that more than one time, everyone here has thought, I am absolutely empty. I have used everything that I've got. There are no assets remaining. I'm here to tell you today that when you feel as if everything you've ever owned is gone and you've lost all your assets, you still have an asset, and that is the volition of God for you. God has a purpose for you, and that will not run out. I've tried this method. You know, I've known this story that I've talked to you about today since I was a child. And I've tried this story. And I've found every time I have ever tried to enact this, it has not been successful. That is, when I was a teenager and I got a car, my car was a 1961 Chevrolet Impala, two-door coupe. It had a 283 V8 engine in it with a 4-barrel carburetor, and it was the loudest dude on the street. And I was sold out in those days. I know that this will be a surprise to a lot of you, but in those days, I was sold out to crappie fishing. Does that surprise anybody? You see, this is not a habit I've acquired recently. This is something I've done all of my life. And so there was a time that came that I had to make a decision. I can either buy some, if Karen was here, Karen would teach me how to say it right, minnows. I was getting minnows, but she said that they use minnows when they fished. We use minnows. So you tell somebody you want some minnows and they don't know what you're talking about. Oh, minnow. I don't know what a minnow is. We use minnows. And she used minnows. But you can either buy gas or buy minnows, and you can't buy both. So, you know what? If you run out of minnows, you can walk. I thought, well, God's going to keep gas in my tank. No, he didn't. This is an outstanding thing that this widow woman for 2.5 years would go back to the meal barrel and nothing was going in it. She kept pulling it out, and God was making provision for her regardless. And when did it run out? It ran out when it was time. When there was another means of provision, the barrel went empty. But up until then, God made provision. Listen, God has got a hand on you. And God has got a purpose for you, and God has got provision for you. And it's not limited by what you think is the limitation. I can't tell this story without telling about the other prophet, Elisha, who became the successor to Elijah. And he ran into also a widow woman. This was a preacher that had passed away and left a widow behind that was destitute and in debt. And they were going to take their 2 sons and sell them into slavery to settle the debt of their deceased father. And Elisha said to the widow woman, you go to all your neighbors and borrow vessels, pans, jugs, jars. I don't know what you would use. I guess we would probably think of something along the line of a jelly can. And she'd go, don't borrow a few, borrow all you can. And she filled her house as much as she could with these vessels that she had borrowed from all of her neighbors and her acquaintances. All that she had in assets was one small pot of oil. And the prophet said, when you get your house full of the vessels, close the door. And then begin pouring from your pot of oil into these vessels. She had the house full of vessels. And she begins to pour. And strangely enough, the jug that she's pouring into is larger than her pot, but she fills it to the brim. And she sets that aside and says, well, give me another one. And so they hand her well, a gallon milk jug, sure, probably, plastic, and she, whatever it was, she filled it up, and much to her amazement, that was full, and she still had some left in her pot, so she said, well, give me another one. And she begins to fill all the jugs and all the jars, all the pots, every vessel that they had borrowed from all their neighbors from one pot, and she filled one after another, till they, so she turns to her son and said, give me another vessel. I still got some of the oil in the pot. And he said, well, that's all the vessels we have. They're all full. Isn't that an amazing thing? Then the Bible says, then the pot ran out. Listen, you might think you're running out, but God knows how much you need. Several years ago, I'd been paying 29.9 cents per gallon of gasoline. How many remembers that day? And when you went to the high places, they'd charge you 31.9 cents. You remember that? Every once in a while, they'd have a gas war. Did anybody ever see a gas war? We pay 9 cents a gallon for gas when there's a gas war. Y'all think I'm making this up, but I'm not making this up. And but they told us we were running out of gas. And so suddenly we were paying 45 cents a gallon. It about took my breath away. I thought, well, they can't sell gas for more than $1 a gallon. There's not any way you can write that on the gas pump. They can't, but they found out a way. They started selling it by the pint or something, and the liter. And then they changed the calibration, and they could sell it for $1 or $2. See, this probably doesn't affect you all like it does me, but we were leaving to go to General Council in Denver in a church van. Had some of the kids lined up. They're going to fine arts. And we left here, and we were paying what I thought was way too much for gas to start with. We were already paying about $1.60 a gallon. And we got up to Wichita, and the gas was $2.20 a gallon. And I said, I'm not paying that. We'll go on. We'll find somebody else. And we did. We found the next one was $2.40 a gallon. It's hard. It was hard. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it's going like that. Because we're running out. That's why they tell us. They tell us that we're running out. We're running out of oil, running out of gas. And the less oil there is left, the higher the price is going. That's what they're saying. And so I had an evangelist stop me at the district council and say, they say that gas is going to go to $2 a gallon. How many wish it would go to $2 a gallon now? He said, I don't know what we're going to do. Said, they say the gas is going to go to $2 a gallon. I don't know how we'll be able to travel around and preach if the gas is $2 a gallon. He said, what are we going to do if they run completely out? I said, here's what I believe. When God made the earth and he put the oil in the ground, I believe he knew how long we were going to be here when he made it. And we may run out someday, but when we do, I think we'll be through. I believe that God knows how much you need when he puts it in. I'm here to tell you that you may think you're running out, but you're not running out. God knows how much you need, and it's God who's making your provision. I got one more part of this story, and I really find this difficult to preach, but it's a true part of the message. I've really never been able to tell much about this woman. I don't know why she was a widow. I don't know why she didn't have apparently one relative, in-law, her own parents, her own sisters, brothers, siblings. No one to help. I never was able to figure that out. And I don't want to be guilty of conjecture to try to figure out, well, why this woman is left so destitute. Hadn't got a brother-in-law. The Bible would have commanded, the law, Old Testament would have commanded, that if her husband that died had a brother, he was responsible to take care of her. But no one's helping. No brother-in-law, no parents, in-laws, no her own parents, nobody. Just her and this boy. And then one day, that boy died. Just a child. And the woman says to the prophet, I should have known this. The day you came into my life, I thought God had come into my life. I thought God had his hand on me. I thought God was using me to keep alive the man of God. I thought God was providing for me. But I should have known. When you came into my life, you only came here to remind me of my sin. And now God has judged me and my baby boy. I had this whole faith exercise, this whole thing about committing myself to God and feeding the prophet and the meal and the oil. It was all about my boy. It was all about saving my child. And now you've come and you've revealed my sin and you've taken my boy away from me. There is nothing like the loss of a child to destroy your faith, to shake you, to leave you confused and bewildered. And I was thinking about this message that I'm preaching to you now yesterday. And I remembered when my 85-year-old grandpa stood holding the hand of his 61-year-old son, my uncle, and held his hand and sang to him and prayed for him and cried over him as my uncle closed his eyes in death. My grandpa was the strongest man, I'm talking about his character, that I've ever known. And I remember him weeping and saying, this is not right. A man should not have to bury his son should bury him. There's something about this that's just not right. It's not natural. We should not have to go through this. And this widow woman that had seen the provision of God year after year, meal in the barrel, oil in the cruse, now says, the only reason I had for living, the only reason I'd pray for God to provide is for me to keep my boy alive. But now you've revealed my sin. I don't know what that meant. I don't know if she meant that just in general some sin of her past that she was being judged for, or if this son was the product of her sin. It was not clear in the scripture. I don't want to add to this story. I just want to tell you that she was tormented and she was in turmoil and everything that was important to her, that moment was not important anymore. And if you've never been there, I'm going to tell you that you will be there. There'll be a day. That isn't a popular thing to say. But I'm going to tell you that in this, I'm speaking to you, Christian, I'm saying in this life, you will have tribulation. There will be a day when you will wonder, why in the world did God not take me home? Why was I not allowed to just go on to heaven and put this behind me? Why am I faced with this now? I'm going to tell you now that you are not only called, and not only has God made provision for you, but I'm here to say to you that God is able to preserve for you your posterity. What that means is that the day you think it's over, it is not over. And when the man of God came in and found this child, and he represented everything that was dear to this widow woman. He gathered him up in his arms and took him into the chamber, his room, and stretched him out on a bed and prayed over that child. And that child sneezed 7 times, came back to life. And that prophet picked him up in his arms and took him back to his widowed mother, presented that child alive. It may seem that everything has died in your life that is important to you. But I'm here to say that God is able to breathe life back into that which is dead. Your life does not end until you have fulfilled the purpose that God has designed for you. I got one more thing I want to share with you. I never have been able to completely understand this correlation between Elijah and Elisha. I mentioned to you that when Elijah was in his ministry, he was considered the chariot of Israel, the horseman thereof. His successor had the same thing attributed to him, the chariot of Israel, the horseman thereof. The Bible tells us that during the ministry of Elijah, there were 17 miracles. Raising this widow's son was one of them. 17 miracles that the Bible gives us that happened under the ministry of Elijah. But his successor prayed that when he filled the office of Elijah, that he'd have a double portion of his ministry. And it's impossible for me to appreciate this fully or explain this fully, but after Elijah saw 17 miracles, Elisha followed him, double portion of the anointing, and 34 miracles accompanied his ministry. But the amazing thing was how many things that happened in Elijah's life happened for Elisha double. And one of those things happened to be that there was a widow woman that, although she was wealthy, and I said a widow woman, at the beginning of the story, she was not a widow woman. She was married, and she's wealthy. At the end of the story, her husband had died before her, and so she was a widow at that time. But she didn't have a child. Double portion of the anointing. And Elisha prayed for her, and in her advanced age, she had a child, which was a great answer to prayer for her. But when that child reached adolescence, he apparently had a heat stroke and died. And Bible tells us how Elisha came, went up into the chamber, stretched his body out across the body of that dead child and prayed, and how that body received warmth and began to move and was alive. God raised that child back to life. Now, the reason I tell you this story is I don't really know what happened to the first widow's son. I know that he was dead, and God raised him from the dead. But in the next generation, when Elisha prays over this dead child, raises him back to life, and restores him back to his mother, what a great miracle took place. Later, his father died, and a famine came to the land, and this was a Shunammite woman. She took her son, went into a far country to avoid another famine. And when the famine was over, brings her son back, and she goes to the king to ask for her land back, because it was used by other people while she was in a foreign country. And when she goes to the king, there the king is talking to the servant of Elisha. And Elisha's servant was just telling the king about this Shunammite woman. The king says, I can't hardly believe that. I just can't believe that this boy died of a heat stroke and God raised him back to life. And as he's saying that, they look at the door, and there they stand, the widow and the son. Folks, don't look at me like that. That's something to kind of get wound up about. I mean, that was quite a deal. And so he said, there she is, king. Ask her. And sure enough, the very woman that he was talking about and her son that God raised from the dead stood right there before the king. Now, that's all great, isn't it? I'm going to tell you a little bit more. We find out what that boy's name was. We never knew the name of the first widow's son. But the name of that second widow's son was Habakkuk. I can't hardly say his name right, but I know I got that name right because if you look in the Old Testament, in the minor prophets, you see his name there. He actually was a prophet and wrote one of the books of the Old Testament, Habakkuk. And what I'm telling you is the devil may try to cut off your posterity. The devil might try to put an end to your story. But I'm here to say to you that God has promised to preserve your posterity. If you commit your way to the Lord, you will see your destiny fulfilled. God will bring to pass in your life everything that he's purposed for you if you will commit your way to the Lord. Now, I can just imagine what might have happened if this woman would have said, and she'd had every right to. Prophet says, give me water. She goes to get the water. Bring me a cake, too, along with that water. And she says, look, preacher, I've paid my tithe. I've already given what I owe. And you're asking me for a cake. That's the last cake I've got. And I'm not going to give that to you. That was her cake. That was her son. And if she'd want to do it, she could have done it. And in a few weeks, both she and her son would have died. But instead, she said, God's commanded me to take care of this man. And I'm going to do what the Lord has given me the opportunity to do. I want to challenge you right now today because I don't know. I don't know what God's spoken into your life. I don't know what visions you've seen. I don't know what dreams you've dreamed. I don't know what it is in your heart that you feel you want to do for the kingdom of God. But I'm here to tell you, if you commit yourself to be obedient to the calling of God and give to him what he puts in your hand, he's able to sustain you, to provide for you, and he will not let your posterity come to an end. He will bring to pass the very purpose for your life and ensuing generations. I'd like for you to stand with me, please.